The primary observation vector required absolute calibration within the cavernous main hall of the Obsidian Citadel. It was an architectural structure designed not for optimal habitation, but for the systematic subjugation of biological weakness. Atmospheric pressure registered at standard Valerian density, a heavy sulfur-tinged mixture deliberately calculated to suppress the respiratory efficiency of lesser atmospheric breathers. In the designated corner of deliberate isolation, the subject known as Lyra remained entirely motionless. The Syndicate mandated that a broken royal, entirely blind to the physical light spectrum and possessing substandard muscular ossification, must serve solely as a static visual testament to the consequences of genetic failure. Her physical utility was mathematically calculated by the central registry at absolute zero. The archival lens zoomed in to continuously record her primary physiological output, logging the white-knuckled grip on the arm of the throne. Her slender, pale digits strained against the polished black stone in a perpetual cycle of unreleased kinetic tension, serving as a physical manifestation of her societal cage. If you intend to study the structural collapse of a civilization, observe this anomaly closely before the Syndicate purges the record entirely. The environmental sensors registered a foreign biological signature at precisely the 14th hour of the solar cycle. Past the grand, sweeping archways of the eastern quadrant, a Terran outrider breached the inner sanctum. The anomalous specimen, designated Kalen, he had piloted a severely battered transport vessel that actively ignored 3 separate proximity warnings before initiating a hard dock. Syndicate protocol dictated that any off-world entity must immediately submit to the localized gravitational subjection field before approaching the high dais. The Terran did not halt his forward momentum. He was a standard bipedal human, nothing more than a fragile. No, the kinetic telemetry indicated he moved with the calculated weight of a siege weapon, bypassing the central authority figures entirely. High Arbiter Vance observed the spatial deviation from his elevated position. The Arbiter's primary combat nodes flushed with bioluminescent warning patterns of deep, radiating crimson, while his heavy dermal plating locked mechanically into a rigid threat response matrix. The Valerians of the Syndicate elite did not display shock through flexible facial expressions. Their biological density simply reorganized for immediate, lethal violence. Kalen ignored the shifting, interlocking plates of the Royal Guards. He walked directly toward the corner of isolation, violating the perimeter of the shunned Royal. As the Terran approached the Forbidden Zone, the archival optical feed temporarily drifted from the subjects to log the structural integrity of the floor. The asymmetrical fractal scratch pattern on the Obsidian Citadel's floor tiles near Lyra's chair contained precisely 42 distinct grooves, deeply filled with compacted atmospheric dust from centuries of neglect. The feed quickly realigned to the primary subjects as Kalen stopped directly before the blind Valerian. In the central archival system, automatically initiated a cross-species threat incompatibility assessment. The analytical data returned an immediate, fatal contradiction. Syndicate law explicitly categorized the defense, interaction, or validation of a broken royal as an act of treason, carrying a guaranteed, unappealable sentence of public execution. A social or emotional bond of any classification was theoretically and legally impossible. Yet the real-time telemetry displayed an impossible physiological deviation. As Kalen knelt, bringing his unshielded Terran face within striking distance of Lyra's rigid form, her physiological baseline began to radically alter. Her historically erratic, shallow respiration stabilized into a slow, measured rhythm, that synchronized with his exact exhalations. The ambient thermal output of her usually frigid Valerian epidermis elevated by 3 degrees, biologically attempting to mirror the Terran's core temperature. The data was fundamentally irreconcilable. Why did the proximity of a genetically inferior, short-lived species override a Valerian's fundamental biological conditioning for isolation? The system flagged the interaction as a critical anomaly requiring immediate termination. Defiance. That was the single behavioral variable capable of explaining the atmospheric shift documented in the room. Kalen spoke softly to her, the localized audio scrubbers failing to catch the exact frequency of his words due to the low decibel range. But the measurable result was instantaneous. He publicly validated her inherent value. He did not treat her as a cautionary exhibit of genetic degradation. He addressed her as a sovereign, living entity. The low, rumbling reverberation of High Arbiter Vance's voice shattered the measured quiet, sending acoustic echoes bouncing off the high-vaulted ceilings of the Citadel. The High Arbiter descended the heavy stone steps of the dais, the impact of his massive, ossified boots registering as minor seismic events on the localized environmental sensors. He pronounced the Terran's actions as a direct, unacceptable contamination of Valerian cultural purity. The mandated response to such an infraction was not diplomatic debate, but a trial by absolute physical combat. Vance decreed that the Terran would face the Ashen Pit to empirically prove the functional worth of his disruptive ideology. The archival system rapidly projected a 99.9% probability of the Terran's violent expiration. The Ashen Pit was not a standard, regulated combat arena. It was a deep, subterranean execution chamber utilized exclusively for discarding massive biological failures and apex predators deemed too dangerous for surface containment. Kalen stood up slowly, rotating his unarmored torso to face the towering High Arbiter. The Terran accepted the lethal parameters without requesting a formal review of the rules of engagement or requesting standard combat shielding. He only turned his head slightly over his shoulder, projecting a localized, focused acoustic wave backward toward the obsidian throne. He stated, for the official record, that he would return for her. Lyra's auditory tracking mechanisms adjusted instantly to the sound. Her head tilted by precisely 4 degrees, her neural pathways mapping the exact spatial coordinates of his vocal projection. Her dermal temperature spiked a second time, a profound, measurable internal reaction to a promise that statistically could not be kept. The Syndicate guards advanced in a coordinated tactical formation, their bioelectric stun lances humming at a lethal frequency specifically designed to overload and paralyze Terran central nervous systems. They escorted the Outrider away from the corner of isolation, marching him with heavy, synchronized steps toward the rusted iron grates that sealed the long, vertical descent into the Ashen Pit. The archival record noted the sudden, steep drop in ambient temperature around the throne the moment the Terran was physically removed from the quadrant. Lyra resumed her original, rigid posture, her spine locking into a defensive alignment. However, the high-resolution biometric feed detected a microscopic, persistent deviation in her right hand. The fingers were no longer locked in a meaningless, strained grip of despair against the stone. They were curled tightly inward, preserving the localized phantom warmth left by the Outrider's proximity. Deep below the surface of the Citadel, the heavy mechanical gears of the Ashen Pit began to grind, initiating the release of the first trial beast. The specimen was a towering, heavily armored subterranean predator engineered for maximum trauma infliction. Now the archivist adjusted the visual recording parameters to capture the impending biological destruction of the Terran Outrider. waiting for the statistical probability of his death to become an empirical fact. The heavy mechanical gears of the ashen pit ceased their grinding sequence, leaving a resonant acoustic vibration hanging in the subterranean atmosphere. The released specimen possessed thick, layered chitinous armor and an array of bladed appendages specifically designed for rapid, localized dismemberment. The archival system predicted a combat duration of less than 40 seconds before the Terrans suffered catastrophic structural failure. Kalen did not engage the beast with matching physical force or attempt a frontal assault. He utilized the vast circular geometry of the execution chamber, evading the initial, devastating lunges with a precise understanding of kinetic momentum and biological blind spots. Locating a discarded, heavy-duty industrial tether cable half buried in the carbonized remains of previous trials, the outrider calculated the creature's center of gravity. He wrapped the thick metallic cord around the beast's primary load-bearing limbs during its recovery phase, leveraging its own immense mass against it. The beast collapsed with a concussive impact that rattled the archival optical lenses mounted on the arena walls. Kalen secured the kill efficiently, targeting the soft, unarmored respiratory vents exposed during the creature's frantic struggle to right itself. High Arbiter Vance's thermal signature spiked violently on the monitor, his internal heat vents opening to violently expel the sudden surge of pressurized gases generated by his biological outrage. Refusing to log the empirical result as a legitimate victory, the High Arbiter immediately reclassified the parameters of the engagement. Vance mandated a secondary psychological trial, forcing the Outrider directly from the ashen pit into the labyrinthine depths of the fractal catacombs. This shifting subterranean structure utilized a continuous rotation of mirror illusions and acoustic dampeners perfectly engineered to induce rapid sensory deprivation and cognitive collapse in non-native species. The archival drone followed the subject into the claustrophobic corridors, meticulously documenting his progression through the shifting stone walls. The system actively cataloged the Terran's physiological stress markers as he navigated the endless, highly reflective dead ends. The telemetry indicated a total psychological collapse was imminent, as the auditory hallucinations reached a frequency scientifically proven to liquefy Terran cortical tissue. However, the sudden catastrophic shatter of the mirror illusions completely disrupted the observational feed. Kalen had not attempted to solve the labyrinth through spatial memory or visual tracking. He simply utilized the heavy hilt of his vibro blade to systematically destroy the reflective surfaces, generating the cognitive dissonance, marching in a brutal, uncompromising, straight line toward the central chamber. He tracked the low-frequency vibrations of the catacomb's final defense mechanism, isolating the exact coordinates of the monolithic stone guardian. The central chamber of the catacombs housed an ancient, semi-sentient construct of animated obsidian, powered by a single, blindingly luminescent thermal core located within its cranial structure. The Guardian possessed a localized gravitational field that immediately pinned the Outrider against the abrasive stone flooring upon entry. Kalen initiated a sequence of rapid, localized explosive charges scavenged from the previous arena, temporarily disrupting the Guardian's gravitational hold. He scaled the roaring, thrashing stone behemoth, digging his unarmored fingers into the jagged, fractal crevices of its active plating. The archival system recorded the exact moment the Terran drove his humming vibroblade deep into the creature's glowing ocular cavity, fully severing its primary energy conduit just as the first mathematical calculation of surface dawn registered on the external Citadel sensors. The Guardian crumbled into a massive mound of inert, smoking slag. At that precise second, The central archival system registered a secondary massive data cascade, triggering the full reveal protocol regarding Valerian biology. The initial compatibility anomaly recorded in the main hall was not a malfunction of the sensory equipment. The Syndicate's foundational dogma, which explicitly dictated that physical frailty equated to evolutionary uselessness and mandated the strict isolation of broken royals, was empirically proven false the moment that Terran demonstrated that true tactical resilience relied entirely on mental calculation and unyielding willpower rather than sheer, blind biological mass. The Valerian genetic code did not inherently reject physical weakness. It actively sought external kinetic equilibrium. True Valerian biological integration required a partner capable of absorbing and reflecting sheer willpower, an evolutionary puzzle piece that Terran perfectly embodied. The law of strength was a fabricated, artificial suppression mechanism designed solely to maintain the Syndicate's political hegemony, completely devoid of any actual biological imperative. The recorded bond was not an anomaly. It was the optimal evolutionary pathway. The system recalibrated. Kalen emerged from the heavy, iron-wrought gates of the catacombs, just as the ambient lighting shifted to simulate the morning solar cycle. Up in the main hall, Lyra felt the vibrational change in the Citadel's floorboards and experienced a sudden burning spark of defiance, rising slowly from her isolated position to face the remaining guards. However, High Arbiter Vance immediately signaled a silent purge, deploying his elite assassins into the shadowed corridors surrounding the exit to ensure the data anomaly was permanently erased. As Kalen reached the upper landing, the cloaked figures dropped silently from the vaulted ceiling. Lyra immediately regressed into a rigid, physiological panic state, her respiratory rate plummeting as the lethal, familiar threat of the Syndicate manifested right in front of her. The archival audio sensors locked onto a completely irrelevant environmental detail during the sudden eruption of violence. Amidst the terrifying hum of unsheathed thermal blades, the microphone recorded the rhythmic, metallic dripping of coolant fluid from a severed overhead conduit, a mundane mechanical failure echoing loudly over the sounds of close-quarters combat. Kalen engaged the assassins with ruthless, calculated efficiency, utilizing their own momentum in the confined space of the narrow corridor to systematically dismantle their tactical formation. He neutralized the final guard, stepping over the armored bodies to reach the main hall. Witnessing his survival, Lyra bypassed all deeply ingrained societal conditioning and stepped forward into the center of the room, loudly and publicly declaring her permanent biological and social bond to the Outrider for the official record. This is the final empirical entry appended to the Obsidian Citadel's primary cultural registry before the entire data system was taken offline. The visual feed captured the two subjects departing through the Grand Eastern archways, heading outward toward the unregulated, unknown frontier entirely beyond the Syndicate's territorial borders. The recorded evidence of their departure rendered all previous legal frameworks mathematically and socially obsolete. The camera zoomed in for a final, high-resolution capture of the subject's physical connection, ensuring the permanent documentation of the evolutionary shift. The historical record previously showed the broken royal's pale digits locked in a white-knuckled grip on the arm of the throne, signifying a lifetime of unreleased kinetic tension and societal despair. Now, if those same slender fingers rested lightly, yet with absolute unyielding security, against the bruised and unarmored forearm of the Terran, they walked together into the abrasive, unfiltered light of the primary star. The heavy doors of the Citadel sealed shut permanently behind them, leaving only the quiet hum of the empty, towering hall.